Hello, everybody. Okay. Hello, everybody. Unfortunately, the music's not working right now. I'm going to continue to see if I can get it fixed. So until then, just be sure to read those prayer requests popping up. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
That's because I was muted, Amanda. Okay, so I'm going to run through what
I
I
know.
just said. Thank you, Miss Pat Carroll, for the like. I appreciate that as well. That does absolutely help us out. So for you guys on YouTube, I'll run back through what I said very quickly. Sylvia mentioned on Facebook, we need to pray for Chuck, her uncle, who goes back to the doctor tomorrow at 10, and is going to have the cyst removed that we've been praying about that is in his back. So you guys be sure to be in prayer for him before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We're also continuing to pray for David Fowler, who was recently in the hospital for an AFib. And as I understand it, has a few doctor's appointments coming up regarding his health. So be in prayer for him as well. We're still praying for Melissa Dixon, who was in the hospital with sepsis and wasn't looking good, multiple organ failures, kidney failure, and liver. And then we got an update on Melissa Dixon and said that they removed the ventilator and she was up and talking a little bit, very weak, but it was to be expected. Still not out of the woods, but there was progress. And we're very grateful for that. We're still praying for Melissa until we hear that she is, in fact, out of the woods. So just continue to be in prayer for her. We're still praying for the Bates, Tammy and Jillian, who are related, but in two separate instances were hit by two separate vehicles, both of them seemingly accidents, and we're praying for them as well. Continue to pray for the Dickinson family for the loss of Devin Dickinson. Very tragic situation there. Boy, only 11 years old. Extremely heartbreaking. So be in prayer for them. Everything else that we're praying for that I didn't mention will be on our pre-show. So after we're done being live here, you can go back and check those out. If you missed anything, you can be sure to write those down and be sure to pray for them. As we all pray together, there's nothing stronger than Christians uniting in prayer. And if we all pray together, we begin to see the Lord work, don't we? So that's an encouraging thing. We are continuing this evening our series on animals in the Bible. Now, we've talked about several different kinds of animals. We talked about doves, we've talked about ravens, we've talked about lions, we've talked about serpents. We've even talked about unicorns. Well, tonight, we're talking about another amazing creature. You'd say, Pastor, isn't a unicorn a mythical creature? You're going to have to go back to that lesson to find out for yourself. Because unicorns are mentioned in the Bible. And I give my take on that in that lesson. Tonight, it's going to be another amazing creature, much like the unicorn. It's going to be one that we probably don't have in the world today, at least not anywhere that we've been able to see. Tonight we're talking about the Leviathan. The Leviathan is given to us in Job 41. And it's talked about in great detail. And we're going to talk about the Leviathan tonight. As amazing a creature as it is, we do learn some things that Job learned about his relationship with God we can apply ourselves, all through looking at the Leviathan. So we're looking forward to that this evening. I'm just looking through here. I think I've mentioned all the prayer requests that we have this evening, but if you have a prayer request, something that you would very much like for us to pray for, do be sure to mention it. If you mention it this evening, I will do my best to read it out loud for everybody, and then we can all pray together. And we're stronger when we're praying together, and that's the truth of it. So tonight we're going to go ahead and jump over to our Bible cam, but don't feel like you're interrupting. If you have a prayer request, please feel free to mention anything you need to us. If you have a question about the lesson, feel free to leave a comment about that as well. If I'm still alive, I'll do my best to answer. All right, so here we are at our Bible cam. We're in Genesis 13. That's not the place we want to be. We want to be in Job 41. So let's jump over to Job 41. We do like to use Blue Letter Bible here. I don't mention that a whole lot, but that is the one. A lot of people like to use eSword, so forth like that. That is my go-to sort of Bible online, is the Blue Letter Bible. But in Job 41, we see the amazing creature, the Leviathan. Let's take a look at it. It says, "Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook in his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? These are all things that they did to sea creatures back in this day. Verse 3 says, will he make many supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Talking about the Leviathan to Job. Is he going to do these things for you, Job? Will he make a covenant with thee? Will thou take him for a servant forever? Can you make the Leviathan to serve you? Verse 5, he says, wilt thou play with him as thou playest, wilt thou, if I can make my tongue work properly, play with him as with a bird, like a pet bird that you flies out and comes in and you play with? Wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? Shall the companions make a banquet of him? Shall they part him among the merchants? Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? If you've ever read much, some of those whaling books like Moby Dick and so forth, you know what a whaling spear is. Or I mean, a fish spear might be. Some of those whaling spears that they used to use, quite large, and they would use to spear the whale as they were hunting them back when that used to be legal. Quite a large weapon. And the irony of God asking, you going to use one of those on him? Because you wouldn't be able to. Verse 8, he says, lay thine hand upon him. Remember the battle. Do no more. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him? Terrifying creature, evidently. Verse 10 says, none is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before him? And then finally in verse 11, he says, who hath prevented me that I should repay? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine, God says. So we see here the futility, the uselessness, the pointlessness of opposing Leviathan. It's useless. It'd be useless to do any of these things to Leviathan. Look what he asks. We mentioned some of this before. He says, canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons? That's irony, because you wouldn't be able to fill his skin with barbed irons. Or his head with fish spears. You wouldn't be able to fill his head with fish spears. Evidently, his skin is too strong. You'd say, well, that sounds a little bit ridiculous to me, that the skin is so strong that you can't break through it. That sort of a thing exists in nature, even in our world today. Look at the hide of a rhinoceros. Some pretty sturdy skin that those things have. Not easily hunted. Some other things mentioned about the Leviathan and the vanity of hunting him. He says, canst thou put a hook into his nose? We're talking about a massive creature. So, of course, we can't put a hook into his nose or bore his jaw through with a little thorn of a thing. We can't make him our servant. We can't serve him up at a banquet like you do other fish. You can't play with Leviathan as you do with other birds. Of course you can't do these things. It would be futile. It would be useless. It'd be pointless. But what we see is a comparison, right? Because it's not necessarily just about Leviathan. God is trying to show Job something here. Because Job, through the conversation with his friends, if you don't know the book very well, he had become a little bit bitter about all the loss that he had endured. And he becomes a little bit bitter and a little bit questioning of why God would allow this to happen. And so God begins to answer him here by showing him all of his creations. And here toward the end of the book, we see God showing Job the Leviathan, as he calls him there in verse 1. So he says about Leviathan, about all these things, and how absolutely pointless it would be to try to do any of these things to the Leviathan. I mean, imagine trying to hunt a blue whale. The blue whale is the single largest living creature to have ever existed. Look it up. The blue whale is larger than any of the dinosaurs we've discovered. It's larger than any sea creature we've ever found evidence of. The blue whale is the single largest creature known anywhere at any time. And yet, this portion of scripture would lead us to believe that the Leviathan may very well have been even larger than that. There's a lot to be fearful of when it comes to the Leviathan, and yet, when we look at the Leviathan, we see not just the futility of opposing Leviathan, but how much more futile it is to oppose the creator of the Leviathan. How pointless it is to oppose such a ferocious and monstrous creature, and how much more pointless it is to oppose the creator of that creature. So it isn't necessarily a comparison between the greatness of Leviathan and us. It's rather comparing the greatness of God to us. Right? Because what we see in verses 1 and 2 is he's asking these questions. Can you draw out Leviathan with a cord? Can you throw your little fishing pole in the water and pull up this monstrous beast? Can you draw out his tongue with a cord which you let down? And of course you can't. We're getting a picture of a hook and a fishing rod here is what we're getting a picture of, or a very archaic version of that. And obviously, of course you can't. Verse 2, continuing with that thought, because even with the greatest tools of the trade at his disposal, with all the most modern technology he may have had, no matter how hard he tried, Job could never have drawn Leviathan out of that water. No matter how hard he tried, Job was never going to be able to capture a creature like the Leviathan. And I believe that in this moment, Job was seeing Leviathan. I think God picks Job up and sort of takes him on a whirlwind tour of creation and of all the created universe. And I think he's showing him some of the highlights of his creations. He shows him the Leviathan and how monstrous and ferocious and fearsome it is. I think that's why it's so aptly described to us here, but also we see how pointless all of these things would be. How pointless it would be to try to summon up Leviathan with even the greatest tools at his disposal. We try so often to make things happen. We come up with a plan. We decide what we want from our lives. And then when they don't work out, instead of taking a minute, grieving over the loss of our formulated plans, and then moving on to something else, we refuse to accept it. We bitterly hold on to these things we think we're supposed to have that we're not supposed to have. And too many times we don't listen to the Lord when he says, I've got something better for you. Just trust me. And we try to summon up our own Leviathan in life. We try to force this thing to happen that is never going to happen. Right? Because the question becomes, we can't do these things. We can't draw out Leviathan, but guess who can? God can, right? And if you're really and truly and genuinely following God's will for your life, and it's still just not happening, just wait, right? Just be a little patient with the Lord. Sometimes these things take longer than we want them to. But if we'll just be patient with the Lord, he can draw Leviathan out. Jesus told us in the New Testament that if we would have faith as a grain of mustard seed, we could command a mountain to move. That our power on this earth in the Lord would be limitless. We're only limited by the amount of faith we have in God. It's an amazing thing to think that we don't have the power to draw out Leviathan, but we have access to someone who does have that power and much, much more. Verses 3 and 4, we see he talks about making supplication. Will he make supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? And what is he saying here? He's saying, Job, the Leviathan doesn't answer to you. It doesn't humble itself before your presence. But what he's insinuating here is that the Leviathan would do that in God's presence. Not in our presence, but in God's presence. Verse 4, he talks about making a covenant with thee. take him for a servant forever. There are some implications there. It might be that God is using the Leviathan to protect something, perhaps in those places so far deep down into the oceans we can't reach them, even with our greatest equipment. That there is something the Leviathan is way deep down there guarding. There are parts of the ocean that we have no idea what's down there, and it could be virtually anything. And it could be that the Lord has summoned Leviathan as his servant to protect it. But the point being that this creature, this monstrous, ferocious creature, is obeying God. That this creature is his servant. That's an amazing thing to think of. That we're serving the same being that the Leviathan serves. That his master is our master as well. And that if we will obey the Lord and will trust the Lord, then all of this amazing power he has, he'll use for us. Truly incredible. We see in verses 5 through 9, we read earlier, talking about the comparison to other animals and so forth, playing with him as a bird, like a pet, like you might play with your dog or your cat, and so forth. And you enjoy playing with your dog or your cat. Maybe you have a pet bird. Amanda's freaking out about the thought of right now because she can't stand birds. But maybe you have a different kind of pet. I knew a guy who had a pet snake once. And that was really odd, but it was his pet and he enjoyed it. So more power to you, I suppose. But there are all kinds of pets out there, right? And God is talking about the Leviathan as though it is his pet, this incredible creature and being. Wilt thou play with him as with a bird? Wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? Notice in verse 6, it's another, Amanda says, yep. There it is. Verse 6, he's talking about making a banquet out of Leviathan. So sometimes we take animals and we eat them, right? Whether it be chicken or whether it be beef or whether it be pork or different kinds of meat. Hopefully I'm making you hungry. But we take these things and we turn them into food sometimes. Could you imagine something as ferocious as Leviathan being turned into food? Couldn't be. Couldn't possibly be. This thing is too fierce. It's too ferocious, too monstrous, too powerful. It's way too powerful. There in verse 6, talking about these things. Verse 7, filling his skin with barbed irons, filling his head with fish spears. And we kind of talked about fish spears and those spears they used to use for whaling and so forth. They'd have a rope attached to, and they would be hunting the whale and so forth. If you've ever read Moby Dick, like I said earlier, it kind of gives you an idea of what that sort of thing might have been like. And could you imagine hunting a creature as monstrous as the Leviathan? You couldn't possibly do it. Whales were considered to be a monstrous hunt back in the day when it was still legal. And can you imagine a creature like this that puts a whale to shame with its size and ferocity and the toughness of its skin and so forth, as we see described here. And then we see verses 8 and 9 talking about the futility. Lay thine hand upon him. Remember the battle. Do no more. The hope of him is in vain. One should be cast down even at the sight of him, fainting at the very sight of this thing, and how amazing and ferocious it is, and how it talks about all these different animals that we've tamed and conquered. And you can go to the zoos and you can see ferocious lions, and you can see the wild gazelle, and you can see all these amazing, incredible creatures in a zoo, rhinoceros and hippopotamus and so forth, crocodiles and all these kinds of things. Every animal upon the whole face of the earth, but this massive creature destroys all that dare to gaze upon it. We have conquered and mastered and tamed every animal there is. We're not going to be able to tame this one. This one we don't control. It doesn't answer to us. And we need to get that concept in our minds about God. Because we control, as human beings, sort of our whole world. Right? We control every aspect of it. We understand every aspect of it. But when it comes to theology, when it comes to God, there is going to be a couple of aspects that are beyond us. God, he's beyond us. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. There are going to be some things that God knows that you don't. You're not as intelligent as him. He's creator God. That's not to say you're not intelligent. You're very intelligent. You're probably more intelligent than me. But none of us are as intelligent as God. Right? We think about the wisdom of God and the longevity of God. He's been here since creation. None of us can attain to that wisdom. None of us can attain to the might of God, whose very voice beckons the universe to exist, right? So some things are beyond us. God is not something that we can contemplate as fully and wholly understanding. Some things we have to just to accept by faith. Our human minds can't take it all in. We're not as smart as God is. So in order to accept him, we have to accept him by faith. There are so many people who say that the existence of God, it just doesn't make sense to them. They just don't see how a world with so much pain and suffering, how God could truly exist in that sort of a world. Well, you don't understand. That's the thing about it. We don't understand, because in order for this world to exist in perfect peace and harmony, he'd have to take away from us our free will, right? He's not the one that messed it up. It's us. We messed it up and continue to mess it up. Even people who don't believe in God, they believe in, let's take, I don't know, global warming, for example, and how we can fix as a society global warming if we'll do A, B, C, and D, and not everybody can agree on that, and everybody's going to do it. So even those people believe that we're still messing up this earth, right? You can't blame everything on God. As a matter of fact, there's very few things. There's nothing we can blame on God. We messed this world up. With our sin and our selfishness, we messed it up. Not God's fault. Right? How dare we attain to blame him for anything? That's kind of the point of Leviathan. This massive creature, we saw verses 10 and 11, to imagine the awesome and terrible nature of the Leviathan is to imagine the even greater awesome and terrible nature of God. And how high and lifted up he is, how holy and sacred he is, how amazing it would be to be in his presence. It's a truly incredible thing. We see the futility of opposing Leviathan, but then starting in verse 12, we see the ferocity. Right? We see the ferocity of the Leviathan. And verse 12, see how far we go here. We're going to read this in portions so as not to overwhelm everybody. But in verse 12, it says, I will not conceal his parts, nor his power, nor his comely proportion. Who can discover the face of his garment? Or who can come to him with his double bridle? In other words, the way you set a horse to ride it. You come to a horse, you tame a horse, right? Maybe you've seen cowboys and doing that sort of a thing, taming horses. You put the blanket on them, you put the saddle on them. Maybe you've seen a John Wayne movie where they do that. But that's what it's talking about here. Putting the garment on, putting the bridle in the mouth of Leviathan so that you can ride it. That's what he's saying here. Who can do that? Who's going to ride the Leviathan like you ride a horse? Who can open the doors of his face? So now we're starting to get description of what the Leviathan actually looks like. It's incredible. His teeth are terrible roundabout. So he's got ferocious looking teeth. His scales are his pride. So he's got scales, but they're hard, they're tough. Shut up together as with a close seal. Can't get underneath those scales. They're like armor. They've been sewn together. They've been, sort of welded together. And they're very strong and tough. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another. They stick together, but they cannot be sundered. You can't separate one scale of this creature from another. By his neesings, a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Pretty incredible thing. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Now, I hear you saying right now, okay, Pastor Strange, now you're getting a little out there. We're talking about a fire breathing creature. We're talking about a monstrous, ferocious, scary looking creature with sharp teeth and scales that are strong, that stick together, that can't be pierced, that can't be separated, and now he's fire breathing. Okay, Pastor Strange, you're talking about a dragon. You're talking about a dragon now, and you've gone too far. It's a mythical creature. They're not real. They don't exist. Hang in there with me. Okay? We're going to address these things, okay? Just hang in there with me. Because it does continue to speak about this creature. Out of his mouth go burning lamps and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils go with smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. And now you might think from you read that, yes, maybe it is talking about a dragon. But remember, up in the first few verses, we talked about drawing it out with a hook, right? Putting a fishing spear into it. So this is a creature that lives in the water. So it's not a dragon. That's not what we're talking about. His breath kindles coals and flame, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves. They cannot be moved. So don't forget, we're talking about a comparison to God. The strength of the Leviathan and the might of the Leviathan represents the fear of God. Now, don't be afraid of that phrase, because it doesn't mean what a lot of people tell you it means. It doesn't mean you better obey God or he's going to smash you. That's not what it means. The fear of God is a bit like the fear of somebody in a very powerful position, right? You're going to behave a little differently around that person. And maybe it's even a good person. Maybe it's somebody who would never abuse that power. But you're intimidated because they have the power, not because they use it, right? So the fear of God is more not necessarily what he will do, what he could have done and chose not to do. Because as sinners, we deserved a certain kind of punishment, but instead, he chooses to forgive us as sinners and chooses to love us instead. And it's truly an incredible thing. So what we see in Leviathan is we see the kind of wrath God could have showed us and chose not to. So it is still an analogy of sorts. So as we're looking through these things, out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot. His breath kindled coals. We're talking about fire breathe, literally fire coming out of his mouth. Oftentimes the Bible is referred to as a burning fire, a bright light, and so forth, that is described as the Word of God. Right? So what we're saying is that God has this fire. Fire's not always bad. We think of fire as bad, right? We think of it as bad because it can destroy virtually anything if it gets hot enough. A fire can take down an entire forest. It can take down homes. It can be incredibly damaging and destructive. But fire can also do some good if it's used properly. Right? Thank you so much for sharing the stream. I appreciate that. A fire can bring warmth when we're cold. Right? You ever been around camping in the winter time and somebody finally gets that campfire lit? And everybody comes swarming around, don't they? Why? Because it's cold, and that fire brings warmth. You know, what else? You know, fire, we use it to cook our food. Because if we couldn't cook our food, then we'd get salmonella and all kinds of other horrible diseases from our food. But we can cook our food with fire as well. So it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes fire can be very useful to humanity. We wouldn't have gotten very far without it. Right? So fire can be destructive, it can be damaging, but it can also be a blessing, and that's like God. If God be for us, who can be against us? And the fire of God can be a blessing to us. And it can be something that is on our benefit and on our side. But if we choose to stand against that fire of God's wrath, there's no hope for us. We need the Lord on our side, and we need the forgiveness and the blood of Jesus to save us from our sins, right? Another thing I read, sorrow was turned into joy before him. Right? Isn't that just like the Lord? He takes our sorrow and he turns it into joy. And I can't tell you how many people, old and younger, that I've heard say, I went through this really horrible thing. And in that moment, I thought, I can't imagine why I must have gone through this. There can never be a good reason for this. There will never be a good reason for this. And then I look over my life as time went on and realized if those bad things didn't happen here, I would never have been able to have all the good things that I enjoy in life now. Right? So it's a matter of taking that sorrow and turning it into joy. And sometimes the only way that happens is with the seasoning of time. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They're firm in themselves. They cannot be moved. The Bible says that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He says, I am the Lord and I change not. Therefore, ye sons of Jacob are not destroyed. And we see that God doesn't change. He cannot be moved. He is the same today that he was back then. He is God. Right there, he's firm in himself. He's self-sufficient, self-sustained. He is God in that way, and we see that sort of comparison with Leviathan here. His heart is firm as a stone, yea, as hard as a piece of the nether millstone. When he raiseth up himself, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breakings they purify themselves. The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold, the spear, the dart, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. The sling stones are turned with him into stubble. Darts are counted as stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear. Sharp stones are under him. He spreadeth sharp pointed things upon the mire. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. Not a dragon. Lives in the water. That's what the deep is. To boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like a pot of ointment. He maketh the path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. White capped. You know, when water starts to boil on the top. Upon earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. He beholdeth all things. He is a king over all the children of pride. This is the Leviathan. And again, it represents the greatness of God. As ferocious as this creature is, imagine how much more ferocious its creator is. But we wanted to come back to that question, right? This can't be an actual creature. We've never seen a creature like this. We've never discovered any evidence of a creature like this. And, you know, there is some wiggle room there, because there are a lot of people a lot smarter than me that tell us no, these creatures never existed, and they tell us exactly what these creatures looked like. And you take the T-Rex, right? And you look at the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and you see the bone structure of it, and they tell us what it must have looked like based on that bone structure. Have you ever seen the skeleton? That's okay, Aaron. It's good to have you popping up with us at any point in time. But have you ever seen the skeleton of a beaver? I mean, I'm not, it looks a lot like a T-Rex skeleton. And so I'm not saying they were giant beavers, obviously, but I'm saying might not be what our best guess thinks it was, right? So it's possible that things existed in the past that we don't have anymore today and still can't find any evidence of, per se, right? So that's just a possibility. I want to put that in your head. It's possible, right? That things existed back then we haven't discovered evidence of. Now, having said that, there are a couple of things that make us feel like the Leviathan could have actually existed. For example, a pocket of combustible gases exists in many known species even today. Bioelectricity also exists in known species, and if powerful enough, it could generate the necessary spark to ignite the gas to cause literal fire breathing. Okay, that is an actual possibility. When we read that and think how ridiculous, that is something that may have existed in the past. It might still exist. Like I said, we don't know what's way deep down in the depths. But the heat resistant oral cavity is also possible, but also not necessary, because suppose the animal's bioelectricity were channeled through its long tongue, which would stick out to ignite the gas and then immediately retract. That would fire breathing would take place outside of the mouth and wouldn't necessarily burn anything up or catch it on fire. So what I'm saying is there are evidences of creatures that exist today that have all the different parts that make this creature's existence possible. The Leviathan, basically an underwater dragon, might have existed at some point. And how amazing God's creation is. And when we look at these animals, we see glimpses of God. We see glimpses of their creator. But as amazing as these creations are, it just shows us how much more amazing the creator of these things are. The God that made this thing, as amazing as it must have been, how much more amazing is the God that made it? Now, folks, I'm a literalist. Okay, so that means I believe when the Bible says something happened, I believe it happened. I believe Genesis 1 literally. I believe in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth in a literal way. And I don't take that lightly. Now, a lot of people may not necessarily take that in a literal way. You know what? The Lord will straighten out whoever's wrong when we get there. But he goes into a lot of detail about a creature here for something that evidently some people think is just an analogy. But whether you're here or whether you're there, I hope you understand that God is amazing. As a creator, he's amazing. And I hope you discover just how amazing he is for yourself. Well, that's going to be our lesson for this evening. I want to thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to Sylvia. Let me see if I can pull up all the names here. I think Sylvia was the first one. To Sylvia, to my mom, to Miss Pat Carroll, and to my mom for sharing the stream as well. We are also on YouTube, for you guys who don't know. If you have a hard time finding us on Facebook, you can go follow our YouTube channel, and we're live there as often as we are here. And whichever one you go to, it supports us and we appreciate. But we will be back on Sunday morning for our series on family resemblance. Actually, I tell not the truth. It's going to be Hot Dog Sunday, so we've got our game this Sunday. I'm looking forward to that. So in any case, it should be a fun time. Be sure to tune in and watch then, and we'll be back then. So until then, guys, bye.